Well, today, Robert McBride, the former head of the Independent Police Investigative Directorate, or Ipid, will be on the stand for the fourth day, giving testimony at the Zondo Commission of Inquiry. The commission, whose mission is to investigate state capture, has started zoning in on the capture of law enforcement institutions, such as Ipid, the Hawks, the National Prosecuting Authority, or the NPA. Giving his own account, McBride has described the central role played by police in some of the wrongdoing. Karyn Maughan is a legal journalist from Tiso Stars, and she's here with us in studio to try and unpack and unravel some of the details that have been leveled out there. Good to have you. Thanks so much for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
I mean, this story, if you try and jump into the story now, it is so complicated. There are so many plots and twists and turns and innuendos and characters that are involved in all of this. It's almost impossible to unravel it. But from your perspective, if you can perhaps give us a little bit of an insight into what McBride's testimony is talking to and detailing for us right now.
I think what's so important is essentially what he's doing is he's providing sort of meat to the bones of the evidence that came out from Angelo Agrizzi about this idea that, for instance, the National Prosecuting Authority was open to kind of capture, and that there were elements or people within that structure that could be bought by Bosasa in order to further their interests. Now, we know Nonkobo Jiba, for example, former acting head of the NPA, it has applied to cross-examine him and counter him. But the fact of the matter was, in that particular situation, despite quite compelling evidence, there was no prosecution pursued against Bosasa until very recently. A decade it took, despite the SIU saying we have what we believe is a basis to prosecute on charges of fraud and corruption. What Robert McBride is doing, essentially he was head of the Independent Police Investigative Directorate, which is tasked with investigating the police. And as such, he handled or was involved in pretty central matters. And one of the pivotal ones was the so-called Zimbabwean rendition case that occurred in around 2010, in which a number of Zimbabweans, the allegation was, who were wanted for the murder of a police officer in Zimbabwe, were illegally taken over the border and presumed to have been murdered or disappeared in Zimbabwe. Now, there was a narrative that he was somehow linked to that. There were Shadrach Sabia, certain pivotal people. Anwar Dramat was involved in that. And McBride and Ipid then needed to investigate that because they are the police oversight body. He's saying essentially what happened was an initial report that they did, sort of raised suspicion about behavior, but subsequent investigation, things like phone records, which showed that none of these people were on the scene, that it was very hard to show that they were substantively linked in any way to what had occurred, meant that they could not persist with the prosecution. And then extraordinarily, because of that decision, because of McBride doing what he is constitutionally mandated to do and saying we can't go ahead with that, he was then subsequently charged. Dramat was charged. So what essentially he's saying is that there was a drive to neutralize people within the law enforcement agencies who were attempting to do their jobs. And I'm very interested to see when and if we hear evidence from Anwar Dramat, because at the time that he was forced out, Dramat had actually written to central authorities, I think including President Zuma, to say, at the stage where all these things are happening, I'm sitting on very, very high profile dockets, including at that time the Nkandla investigation.
Yeah.
This is going to be perceived in a certain way. So when Dramat comes, I think we're also going to get a real sense of the kind of things that the Hawks had been doing, which they were prevented from persisting with.
I mean, it is interesting because, when you look at this whole issue of Anwar Dramat, Leslie Sibir, Maluleka, they keep re-emerging. And looking at his suspension that resulted in criminal charges against McBride. So, is there any weight to what he says, that this was all a conspiracy?
Well, I think, and you could see the DCJ Zondo having sympathy with them. If you're doing, his version is, I was doing this investigation. We thought potentially they could be implicated, but then we have this other evidence which shows that, there's a significant gap in evidence that we can't necessarily prove that this is the case, and it causes us to review our findings. And so we changed the report. I changed the report. And that was what he was charged with, was illegally altering the report. And you could see that Zondo was like, well, this would have been an appropriate thing to do in the circumstances. One has to it's been pretty one-way traffic. I mean, I'm going to be interested to see if someone like, for instance, Nathi Nhleko, the former police minister, who McBride has really gone after in quite a detailed way in terms of, his interference. His interference that was actually quite profoundly slammed by the Constitutional Court, because they said you don't have the power as the police minister to suspend the head of Ipid. I really want those people to come to the party and either seek to cross-examine or say to the Commission, we're going to come and give evidence, we believe this is nonsense. But the picture that has emerged thus far is that there was intervention. People were removed, and they were removed in a way that was legally unsustainable. The charges against Ramat didn't stick. The charges against Robert McBride didn't stick. The suspension of Robert McBride was condemned by the Constitutional Court. So, while these people may say they have an argument for why they did what they did, those activities did not result in successful convictions and prosecutions, and they did not result. They resulted ultimately in the Constitutional Court, the highest court in the land, turning around and saying the police minister has interfered with a body that is meant to be a watchdog over the police. How is that possibly constitutionally sustainable?
What was the minister's role at that time? I mean, what did he have any mandate to do that?
No, that's what the court said. I mean, essentially, it's this thing of, and we've seen this rhetoric again, whether it's again and again, whether it was the role of the public protector, the NDPP. There's this idea that, if you're meant to exercise prosecutions without fear or favour, if you're meant to exercise oversight over the police with all the kind of issues that we have in the country, and if you're the public protector and you're supposed to exercise oversight over government, you need to have you need to have independence. You can't be beholden to a political master. And essentially, I mean, I remember at the time that this was happening, Nathi Nhleko was giving evidence and giving interviews, and very, very strong about, this was just completely wrong, and that it was appropriate for him to suspend McBride. Ultimately, the Constitutional Court saying that was really a parliamentary function, that it couldn't be in the hands of someone who, arguably just on a perception level would have had an interest in controlling how Ipid did its job.
So yesterday we also, or during McBride's time, we've heard some audio that's been played, and the person identified as Ipid investigator Mahlangu is heard having a telephone conversation with Khomo, and he's trying to recruit him to come and work for crime intelligence. What does this say about these institutions?
I mean, that stuff emerged during the actual trial when when the case against McBride was persisted with, and it's shocking because these are not, crime intelligence has been kind of a shadowy figure underpinning the South African justice system for quite some time. And these are not the first times we've heard these kind of revelations. That there was essentially, and I think McBride has detailed as well, that there were little, bubbles of police who seemed hell-bent on neutralizing elements that were seen potentially as threats, politically speaking, because they were doing their job. And I think the shocking thing about those recordings, which have never, the authenticity of which have never been disputed, is they show how powerfully, the mechanics almost, of how you go about making these appeals to human beings who are in the police services, who are investigators, to say, you're in this difficult situation, we will offer you a position. If you do this, if you implicate McBride, if you give us evidence, we will look after you. And so for that reason alone, that recording is very powerful, because I think there is that suggestion that kind of very subtle form of corruption was occurring. Yeah. And now we have evidence of the mechanics of it, and this person who, in a very difficult position, despite the offer that was made to him, recorded that and used it as evidence instead of agreeing to go along with what was clearly an offer for a bribe.
I think the most frightening part of everything that we're hearing is, and especially what McBride is painting, I mean, he's painting this picture of a corrupt system of law enforcement agencies, falsified evidence against people, others used as scapegoats, falsely implicated in crimes. What does this do? What does this tell us about our institutions that are supposedly our law enforcement agencies?
Well, I mean, all of this the height of it was sort of around 2015. And, I remember reporting on all these cases in the sense of complete lunacy, because oftentimes you would get to court and you'd say, well, what is the evidence? And, it would become manifestly apparent that this was at best a very, very shaky case, and at worst definitively politically motivated. You know, Shamila Batoy has been in office since the 1st of February. She's the new National Director of Public Prosecutions, announcing a number of far-reaching changes to the NPA. The removal, for instance, of Tori Pretorius, who was the head of the Priority Crimes Litigation Unit, in whose hands a lot of these matters, including the SARS matter, the Johan Boysen matter, all of these cases that are now subjected to legal challenges, were handled. But I think the bigger issue is that, you know, it's the same with SARS. It takes years to build up a solid institution. It can take a matter of months to destroy it. And, you know, for human beings, people who are just trying to do their jobs, if they are targeted and attacked and undermined in a workplace that is basically hell-bent on removing anyone who is focused on just the sheer mechanics of holding law enforcement to account or doing their jobs, that has a devastating impact. I mean, I was having a discussion with someone yesterday about an individual within SARS who was one of the experts and was reduced to assisting clients in a client service center rather than doing high-profile audits because they wanted to remove her, and now completely out of SARS. I mean, that kind of human capital cost is massive. So it's not just about, it's about restoring public confidence. It's about reaching out to these people who have left the institution and saying, you know, we want to rebuild it, we want to bring it back to its former glory. But it's also about assuring them and the public that things definitively have changed and that this political interference in prosecutions, which has been manifest for the last few years, is finally over. Just finally, Karyn, before we wrap up and go to news, next witness, Johan Boysen. This is also going to be exceptionally interesting. I mean, he was the former KwaZulu-Natal head at the Hawks. So we've already heard him at the Mokgoro inquiry, and he was saying that Nomgcobo Jiba was under pressure to prosecute him, and in his case he was also implicating the former police minister, Minister Mthethwa. Basically what he said is that a total cleanup at the NPA is needed. And I mean, if these allegations are true, this total cleanup that we're talking about, should it be at just these institutions, or should we also be seeing a lot of government ministers being cleaned out as well? Well, absolutely. And I think the thing is that if you see manifest evidence of people not respecting the constitutional mandate of law enforcement to do their jobs without fear or favor, that is very serious. And I want to hear from people like Nathi Nhleko and Nathi Mthethwa. They need to come to this commission and they need to say on what basis they made those decisions. Now, the pivotal thing to remember is Johan Boysen is currently facing prosecution for racketeering linked to that Cato Manor case. And he has made representations to the NPA about the substance of that case and what to do with it. And I think it's going to be very important when the NPA, Shamila Batoy, makes the decision on that. She says very plainly what she believes the motivation behind that case was, and if it was politically motivated and there isn't substance to it, that it is withdrawn against Boysen. Karyn, should Zondo grant Tom Moyane right to cross-examine Pravin Gordhan? I think he will have to, but it will have to be on incredibly limited grounds, the specific things on which Gordhan implicates him, and he will obviously put in measures to make sure that it doesn't end up into a free-for-all. I think that's what he's going to have to do. Okay, that was our question of the day. Great to have your input into that question as well. Karyn Maughan, thank you. It's always a pleasure speaking to you. It really is, trying to unravel what's going on there, because I think for most people it's exceptionally confusing, but let's just hope that we get to the bottom of it. The current events at the Zondo Commission is what Karyn Maughan was talking to, and the degrees of state capture in our law enforcement agencies. All right, just gone 7 o'clock. Let's get your news from Sakina.